Welcome to Pre-Shift, tidbits of wisdom for everyday service. My name is TJ Griffin, and I'm the corporate wine educator for Winebow. We encourage your questions at any point during the webinar. Please submit them in the Q&A.
And why don't we get started? We're following up on part two from last week, or part one from last week. This is part two, and that is this wonderment and fascination that the general populace has, as well as our fellow professionals, with the idea of food and wine pairing. It is, on one hand, it's kind of simple. If you like it together, then enjoy it together and don't worry about it. But to get it right and to really make these magical interactions of food and wine and other beverages, it takes some thought, it takes some planning, and it takes a little bit of knowledge around both the beverage and the food, which is why really successful sommeliers tend to be pretty knowledgeable about food and cooking techniques and things like that, is because, well, they work around it all the time, but it's also essential for them to do their jobs well. For me, it was a great advantage. One of my jobs at the meetings, my business meetings with the chef, were at the prep table in the kitchen. He would continue his prepping and we would talk business, and I would ask him questions about what he was doing and what he was making and why he was doing this and doing that. And he would answer those questions. And I learned an enormous amount, both about business as well as cooking techniques, that really helped over the long run understanding food. And understanding food made it easier for me to pair wine and food together, beer and food together, spirits and food together. So there are some universal principles that you have to grasp that we talked about last time. So I refer all of you listening and those who might find this on YouTube later, if you didn't listen to part one, in part one, we talked about structure and how that really gets into the world of how you choose food, how you put wine with certain foods, what does sugar do to food, what does acidity in the food do to wine, etc. That's all really core and foundational. And actually, this section that we're going to talk about today is important, but none of what we're going to talk about today will work if you don't understand last presentation. So let's move on into the realities that texture has a huge play in this. And we kind of know this intuitively, because when we experience wine and food together, those things that are really rich, what's a common example would be like really great whipped potatoes or mashed potatoes, right? There's a lot of texture there in addition to the cream and the butter that's added in, but it's very velvety and rich across the palate for texture. So if you take a wine like your typical Pinot Grigio or a Muscadet or something like that, and you try to say, well, I'm going to use the cleansing opposite pairing where I'm going to wash things away with it, the mashed potatoes are just too much for it. But you can step it up a little bit and add the idea of, well, I'm going to use Chardonnay that has been oak aged and has been through some malolactic transformation. And now all of a sudden you have a white wine that is richly textured, and you have a dish that is richly textured. And then the acidity in your Chardonnay becomes the take it from 5 to 9 in your out of 10 pairing, is because you need something to rinse away the richness of the butter and the fat. So that's when you go to the white Burgundy or the rich Chablis or a Chardonnay from a cooler climate, so that it offers you that balance that you were looking for with the Muscadet and the Pinot Grigio, but now you have the weight to go alongside of it. One of the other classic pairings that people always talk about are things like the grape Viognier has a ton of texture in it. And a lot of people struggle to put it with food because it's sort of a cocktail wine on its own. But if you listen to Louisa Rose from Yulumba, she will tell you that Viognier is one of the greatest food pairing wines. And it's because it has tannin in white wine, and it has texture, and it has a richness, and it's a little bit more like red wine than it is white. And she often will tell people that if she puts it in a black glass and it's served at room temperature, people have a hard time telling Viognier away from red wine until they're told what it is. And so all of those things come into play. And so Viognier and lobster have often been paired together because there's that really rich, toothsome texture of lobster. And the Viognier works really well in that realm. Another idea that that you can come across here is when you talk about texture, even in meats, right? So there is a big difference between a grilled steak, cutting it, eating a bite, etc., than the idea of beef short rib that's been braised. You have all of that interconnective tissue in the short rib that makes the texture of that kind of meat completely different than the texture of a steak. And for even the texture of, say, prime rib or a grilled ribeye is completely different than the texture of a tenderloin, like a beef tenderloin. So all of that comes into play and all of it matters. Beef tenderloin is a red meat item that you can serve with red wine that's much lighter than what you think of when you normally deal with steak, all the way into Pinot Noir and even substantial Beaujolais will work with beef tenderloin, depending on what else is on the plate. We're going to talk about accompaniments fairly soon. And there's so TJ's given me a texture in wine can be hard concept for some folks to grasp. Any tips on becoming more adept at recognizing and describing texture? I think that the vocabulary that you need to start with, round, lean, lush, things that, think of it in shapes a lot of times. This wine is and in food too. That's where I tend to talk about it. A friend of mine actually describes wine. He sees wine in his head in complex three-dimensional geometric shapes, and that's how he helps identify one grape variety from another one, is that he sees them that way. And so training your mind to think about it as more than just a beverage is really important. You can practice with things like sparkling wine and the difference in texture across the palate, the way you perceive it by just taking a sip and swallowing it versus taking a sip and holding it there for a few seconds, then swallowing it, and then take a sip and chew on it for a minute and let all of the bubbles escape in your mouth without swallowing. Those are very different experiences of the same wine. Another thing that can help, especially with white wines, is to experiment with white wine at different temperatures. Really cold white wine tends to not feel like it has much texture because it's so cold it sort of numbs the palate. And at room temperature, even a very crisp white wine, a very otherwise perceived as lean white wine, will feel richer. And so this is also a trick you can, if you get really geeky about your pairings, you can even start talking about, and we're going to talk about temperature, what temperature am I going to serve this wine at to best suit the food? And other than that, it's practice. Like when I talk about texture in wine, I tend to think of something visual. Like I taste classic Australian Shiraz, and it feels on my palate the way my eye perceives purple velvet. It's like it's like I could feel that across my palate, and then I can see it, and that's how I tend to think about the textures. I know not everybody thinks like me, and that's probably a good thing, but that's how I deal with texture. So the next step in this one-upmanship of food and wine pairing, where you go from, I know that acid needs acidity, so acidic food needs acidic wine. I know that sweetness in food needs sweetness in wine. I know that alcohol is a clumsy thing and doesn't like to pair it to any part of the food in general. So the next step, I'm going to look for texture. And then another step on that is I'm going to think about cooking method. And this is really sort of an intensity versus intensity kind of game, right? So we have several different pictures here. You got fried frito misto up there on the left, so all that fried fish and fried potatoes, and then you've got things coming off of a grill where they have that char note, and then you've got things like barbecue, which has both intensity of heat and grilling alongside of some sort of sauce that really is going to have a lot to do with it. And then in my left, your left, you're going to see basically just roasted chicken thighs, right? So just putting them in the oven and getting them caramelized through the natural heat. So high intensity cooking, like grilling and searing, the top right of your picture, you're going to be looking for fruity tones in the wine to sort of calm the bitterness of the char. If you take a high tannin wine that's really bitter and you throw it against something that's charred from the grill, those two bittering elements can make each other more intense. So it's not that it can't be done. It's not like you can't put Nebbiolo with a grilled steak, but the Nebbiolo needs to have a little juiciness to it to overcome the bitterness that's being bumped up. Fried anything just loves acidity and potentially sweetness. So one of the things I adore with fried food is champagne style wines, even if they're not from Champagne. So méthode traditionnelle could be Franciacorta, could be Champagne, could be US based traditional method sparkling wine. But the generally elevated level of acidity in those wines is beneficial, and the bubbles are very good at cleansing the fat from the fry away. And then after that, you're really just using fruit on food. But you can also do something similar with, I think, traditional German Riesling at that cabinet level, where it's really racy and really soothing to the palate. That's great with fried food too. Certainly Wiener Schnitzel and Riesling is an awesome concept. And it kind of goes from there. You could also go with, it's not that fried food can't go with red wine, but if you're going to put fried food with red wine, you need to find those red wines that are really tart and racy in the world of red. Sangiovese comes to mind, Gamay comes to mind, Dolcetto, and perhaps Barbera, depending on what it is that's been fried. All right, so then we have roasted, your bottom left. Roasted is very friendly. If you're, when in doubt and you're not really sure what cooking method to go with for the wine you're going to serve, roasting is very friendly. It's right in the middle. It'll be more dictated by the sauce and the sides, where, okay, it's not about the chicken or the roasting. It's about the fact that you're using mashed potatoes or roasted fingerling potatoes, or that you're reducing the sauce out of the pan and turning it and using red wine to reduce it instead of white, or whatever that direction goes. Not up here on the screen is the difference between something like the same dish grilled versus poached or sous vide. So if you take a slice of salmon and you put it on the grill, all the seasonings are the same. You put it on the grill and pair a wine with it, it's going to be a different wine than if you took the same seasonings and you poached it or put it in sous vide, where you have a completely different texture, and the lack of char and the cooking intensity has really taken back a big step. And beef sous vide, I often feel like beef sous vide is almost a white wine dish in a lot of cases, which is a little odd, but a lot of people are sous vide's kind of come and go in its popularity, so maybe it doesn't matter anymore. Barbecue. Barbecue is difficult, not because of the cooking methodology, the braising and the slow cooking method that turns ribs into deliciousness is going to work with a lot of different wines. It's the rubs and the sauces that they put on afterwards or during. And so most barbecue sauce has two additions in it that don't like wine. It normally has sugar of some sort, and it normally has vinegar of some sort. And neither of those two items work with wine very well. Sugar works fine with wine as long as the wine has sugar. But most people sitting down in the US to a table full of savory food, if they're wine consumers, they're probably not serving residual sugar with it, wine with it. I would be happy for them to do so, and I often have convinced them to do so, but that's not their natural inclination. So where do you go with barbecue? You've got to stay real high on the fruit base and lower on the alcohol base. That's really important. The Riesling is always a good call with barbecue, and you just go into the intensity of the barbecue amps up or down which Riesling you choose. Like, I think classic Spätlese out of the Mosel and barbecue pork ribs is fabulous. And then the other option that is coming in now to vogue and has been for a little bit is Lambrusco, a really high quality Lambrusco like made by Lini. For instance, even their Labrusca is actually a magical pairing with barbecue because there's a little bit of residual sugar in that wine. And of course, the barbecue sauce actually really likes the bubble wash away and that little bit of sweetness. So, all right. So TJ, you want me to bring that up, or it looks like everybody's chatting back and forth. So I think that's probably the best way to handle some of this. So I always prefer, TJ was saying, I always prefer wine with food over other beverages. And I don't mean that as a wine snob, but some would argue that wine isn't always the best choice. For example, that beer and sake would be better choice for fried foods. Is there a wine for every dish? No, there actually isn't a wine for every dish. I think you get really challenged to find wine that works in a harmonious way with anything that's heavily spiced, any kind of super intense flavor profile, including capsaicin heat from chili peppers, is really difficult on wine. Wine really prefers more subtle foods. And I think that one's love of a particular cuisine will also start down a path of whether or not they find wine. Like I think beer is probably the best option for spicy food other than just iced tea with sugar in it. Although you can make wine work in that case, it just depends on how spicy it is. Fried food is not impossible with wine. It's just you have to be willing to open up the wine world a little bit and not settle on, well, it has to be Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay or Pinot Grigio or Cabernet or Pinot Noir, or, the top 5 might not be great with fried food, but there's a world of fried food and a world of wines out there to choose from. And I think fried food works with slightly aromatic wines, like Muscofilero and Frito Misto sounds great together. Vermentino and Frito Misto is great together, as one would expect. They grow up in the same place in Liguria. So those kind of things work really well. If the question is from, okay, we're kind of changing methods instead of the Q&A today, which is fine. I'll try to find them in the chat. Troy is asking, sous vide is back with a variety of finishing techniques. Do you find value in contrasting flavors in food and wine as a strategy? Yes, I very much do. For instance, but you have to be careful by always landing in a place where first you have to honor those structural elements, right? So sometimes people think, well, I'll counter an acidic food by not having an acidic wine. That won't work. But you can counter the acidity in the food with sweetness, or you can counter the spice in the food with sweetness. So there is a place for opposites to play, but you have to be careful because acidity isn't one of them and sugar isn't one of them. If the food has sugar, the wine has to have sugar to work. There is a place for that cleansing eradication of flavor, which is sort of a common thought process with Italian whites of tradition, is that their white wines were just cleansing and refreshing and washing away things to get you moving through until you got to your red wine. And that's not a bad pairing methodology. It's limited in its joy, right? Because if the role of the wine is just a cleansing methodology, then the interaction of the two is limited. Flavor alignment, as Troy is following up, is a dangerous slope to get into, but you can do it, right? So you try not to get too cutesy about it, because as soon as you say, wow, that flavor of rosemary in the food's great, and I think this Chateauneuf pop has a lot of rosemary in it, what you'll find out is your impressions of real rosemary versus a note in wine are often not matching up. So you have to think more herbal to herbal and not get too wrapped up in directness. In the contrast concept, to me, contrast a lot of times, like the idea of how well bubbles work with things, like the Lambrusco working with barbecue sauce is a great contrast, because in general, the Lambrusco from Lini that I brought up is a dry wine and the barbecue sauce is not. It has sugar in it, but the bubbles are washing things away and acting as a contrast in flavor alignment, which really, really help. So it eradicates some of that sugar so that the fruitiness of the Lambrusco can then match up with and align flavor-wise with the saltiness of the pork ribs. So that's to me how I line up flavor. And in my own opinion and in my methodologies, I try in every advanced food pairing for sure, I try to give you alignment of some aspects and contrast of some aspects, because that's how it works. So tannin is always contrasting with the fat in the meat. So that's your contrast. And then the alignment is texture, or maybe you choose texture to be slightly off where you're washing things away instead. Temperature is especially difficult. Hot items, meaning things that are hot and liquid, like this bowl of soup right here, and wine are really hard to make work together. And the main reason for that is that you have liquid on liquid. So there's no room for error, and there's no room for the wine to sort of be its own thing. And so in the case of soups, there's a reason that the warm soups of the world are often paired with fortified wines. But let's start with what kind of soups are out there and what kind of temperatures can we deal with? In general, food that hits the plate screaming hot is not going to work with any wine, and it hurts your tongue when you eat it anyway. So let's move into the idea of temperature being a major factor depending on whether we're talking about solid or liquid. Warm food that's solid is fine. You can have it with white wine, which is a counteractive. You can have it with red wine, which is room temperature, and the warming effect of the alcohol starts to match up. But when you get into brothy items like consommé or French onion soup or butternut squash puree soup, those kind of things, now you're dealing with I need a lot of warmth in my beverage to compete with the soup. And you often have pureed natural sugar from the either caramelized onions, or in the case of squash, it's just coming from the squash. And so something that has some residual sugar is a really great. One of my most successful pairings ever with the idea of butternut squash soup, which is very viscous, and it has this sort of natural sweetness, was Grand Cru Pinot Gris from Zenhunbricht, which was probably, I don't know, it probably had 50 grams per liter residual sugar. It was a big, bold, rich vintage. And that with butternut squash soup on a pairing menu was fabulous. I also have tried it with rich Chardonnay, which worked, but not as well because the Chardonnay was dry. In the case of consommes and French onion soup and the like, we're really dealing with residual sugar Madeira, residual sugar sherry. I haven't been successful with port because it could work with tawny port, but the tartness of the Madeira is a more natural match. And the nuttiness of the sherry with that, the floor effect of an amontillado works better with these caramelized vegetable soups and things like that. So big cautionary flag. When you see the soup course go out, you definitely need to think real hard. And those pairings have to be tried to be successful. There is just no way to guarantee you're getting it right without trying it first. And now we're going to get into sometimes the one thing that matters the most in your pairing. And sometimes it's just stuff to be careful of. And that's the finishing touches on the plates. Obviously, this chef has taken a lot of time to create this beautiful dish and give layers of effect and approach of color and everything else. But everything that the chef put on there has to be considered. I'm not sure if he's squeezing romesco sauce or roasted red pepper puree or some sort of tomato base on there for the orange. But whatever it is, it's going to have an acid balance. Did he put vinegar in it to help it keep its color? All of those things you have to ask yourself. And of course, how much of it is going to be in each bite? If that little bit of sauce is never going to be enough in the bite of the guest to start dictating the food and wine pairing, then it won't be as big a concern. But the black item on top of this dish and the white item, those are going to be fairly dominant. And so you have to make sure that you consider those things. Pureed potatoes we talked about earlier, but other things like lentils, like black beluga lentils, they have a texture, they have an earthiness. They're generally cooked with some sort of added flavor, either vegetables, broth or stock to add it with in a vegan way or a vegan or a vegetarian way, or and traditionally where we're not worried about that, then it's going to be some sort of bacon or prosciutto or ham hock or something that seasons it with the smokiness. And so now you have this earthy, smoky, textured item that you need to think about because it's going to be a part of it. The other thing that gets a little rough is the finishing touches that end up with sugar in them. So many sauces end up with one of two enemies of wine in them, sugar or acid. And it's not so much that sugar is an enemy of wine universally, but it really then has you pinned up against the wall where I now need sugar in my wine to really work with this sauce. Again, depends on how much of the sauce is there. And then after that, you got to figure it out. And the acidity depends on the source of acidity. If the sauce's acidity is citric acid, fine. If it's acetic acid from vinegar, then it becomes an issue. So, things like, the simple world of this is ketchup, right? Sugar, acid, and tomatoes, for lack of a better description, is ketchup. But you can make that same sort of fancy sauces that are that flavor profile are called gastrique, and any kind of gastrique is going to be difficult with wine if it starts to dominate any part of the plate. And the last piece is when you're dealing with a plate where the chef has completed the dish without the wine. So it has the crunch, it has the sweet, it has the salty, it has the tang. It's really hard to put wine there because there's no space for it. So when you deal with that, you have to go looking for a wine that just sort of fills in the gaps. And really, if you have a wine with a lot of personality, it'll almost always conflict. All right, so that's finishing touches. Now we're dealing with culture. On one side of this picture, you've got, sort of a Mediterranean market, kind of have an idea of what to expect there. And then on the other side is somewhere in Asia, and a very different sort of eating style, a very different expectation of flavor. All of those things start to play into what your guest is going to actually enjoy when you put the wine and the food together on the table. And one of the things I bring up here is a friend of mine worked in Vegas for a really long time, and he was always amazed at the number of Asian businessmen who would order a dozen oysters and a bottle of Opus One. And he's one of those curious people that really wanted to know, why would they do that? Is this just because they feel like they're supposed to order Opus One? Is it that there is something else going on here? And he kind of came to a conclusion through the force of experience and time that, the culture from which they came valued all things flavor of the sea. And the more it tastes like the sea, the more they love it to a certain degree. And the fact that the oysters would taste more like the ocean or stronger of fish when they put them with red wine would not be a problem for this culture. Whereas when I taste fish and it tastes really fishy, I am not interested anymore. So that pairing wouldn't work for me. So when you deal with culture, always consider it. Are they coming from a culture where aromatic heat is embraced? I lived in Trinidad, West Indies, and the East Indian culture there, their food was just plain hot, sometimes unbearably spicy, always at least noticeably spicy. And wine with that kind of food isn't really going to have a natural home. But if the person eating that dish has grown up on that, they're less sensitive to the spice. They're used to the burn. They like the burn. There is an addiction to heat in food, right? So when the wine makes that food spicier because of the alcohol, they're good with it. And so, it definitely matters to kind of take this holistic approach into who am I talking to, see if you can figure out from where they're coming and what they might like. And a lot of that is conversations with your guest that are, I'm not advocating that you dive into a cultural exploration with your guest, but listen, watch, don't make crazy assumptions, but listen and watch and try and learn and ask questions. And along the way, you'll probably get there to where you can adjust your pairings or be comfortable with pairings that you don't really want to put together. And some of them aren't so crazy, like oysters and Cabernet Sauvignon. What about port and Stilton? How many people, throw it in the chat window if you want. How many of you listening today have been told that port wine, like Ruby style port wine and Stilton blue cheese are a great pairing? Well, the British love it. They think it's fabulous. I think that the port makes the Stilton taste bitter and that the Stilton makes the wine taste even more alcoholic. But you'd be hard pressed to convince anyone off the British Isles that likes wine that port and Stilton aren't an awesome pairing. I think that normal everyday chocolate and dry red wine is a terrible pairing. But if what you're in for it is really, I love chocolate and I love red wine, and your brain separates those two as completely different entities, when you taste them together, your brain keeps them separate. I learned this in a fun exploration where we taught a class and it was called Chocolate and Wine. And we put grades of increasingly sugarless chocolate up through 85% cocoa. And we took a bunch of wines, some that actually are made to work with chocolate and some that people commonly drink with chocolate, right? California Cabernet and chocolate. Thursday afternoon, when you get home and you're stressed out, you have a little chocolate, you have a little red wine. You think it's great. I don't. But your culture is not my culture. Now, Brochetto d'Aqui, great with chocolate. Moscato d'Asti, great with milk chocolate. Port, ruby port, pretty good with bitter chocolate. But, the culture of your guest is going to dictate how happy they are with any of your pairings. All right. So that is the end of that. And now we're moving on. So David sends a comment that he's glad that we mentioned Viognier as a great food wine. And I think that Off-Dry Gewürztraminer works well with spicy food. I wouldn't disagree with you, David. You just have to be careful which Gewürztraminer you get, because even in Alsace, with these riper styles, you can often find that Gewürztraminer is hitting that 14% or more alcohol by volume range. And when it does that, it does start to accentuate the heat of the dish beyond where the sugar can manage it. So it's really important to run that balancing act. If you can keep the Gewürztraminer under 14, it'll probably be okay. And here's another question from TJ. Have you ever played with the concept from Chinese medicine and cuisine of cooling and warming foods? Not sure I understand the principles. I think you're talking about sort of a reference that some foods are cooling to the mind and some are warming to the mind or to the body. And if so, no, I haven't played with that. I may have done it accidentally, but certainly not knowing it. Anything else? All right. All right. So this is the classic, and this comes up all the time. Matter of fact, this was one of the scenarios in the service exam for the Master Sommelier exam that I passed. 4 people at the table, all 4 ordering vastly different dishes, but they are desperate to share one wine. And so what do? How do you run that? And I think that the way you go down that path is a table that all wants to share one wine and they have very different dishes. What you're really talking about in that instance is what wine will make these people happy. And you need to make whatever caveats you have to make about the pairing. Like, this wine is really going to be much better suited to, the dishes on seat 1 and 4, and seat 2 and 3. It's going to be a bit of a compromise, but based on what you've told me, you really like this style of wine. And I think that because you're going to enjoy the wine so much, the pairing will not be as big a deal to you, is the way I normally handle that. And then the other thing is, if they really want to share one wine and one person is really the odd person out, like everybody on the table ordered beef and that person ordered halibut. And so everybody's having a big chunky red wine and the halibut shows up on the table. I normally deal with that on an individual basis. Here's that wine you really love. When we get to the halibut, if you, looking at the person who ordered something different, if you would like a wine that's more suited stylistically to your dish, because you're the one making the big compromise, I'm more than happy to reach through our glass pour list and find a really lovely wine for you to have with that part of the meal. And that normally will sell another glass of wine on top of the bottle and keep everybody happy at the same time. Because what you're dealing with is the emotional, social thing about we shared a bottle of wine instead of 4 disparate glasses. There's a very different feeling after dinner when you've had different beverages than each other, than you've shared a memory with that one bottle. All right. So we're going to take a break through the holidays because, we need a break. You need a break. So our next episode is going to be talking about post-holiday bubbles. Just because the celebration, quote unquote, is over, that's no reason to stop drinking sparkling wine. And we're going to cover a couple of wine options from countries and appellations that fit into the post-holiday budget. That'll be January 12th. I am definitely looking forward to having everybody join us again. Remember that you can find all of these episodes on our YouTube channel, Winebow YouTube, and then find the pre-shift playlist. this episode will be up there before the end of the week. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, TJ, for punting and figuring out how to make the chat window work. Thanks for everybody's patience while we had technical difficulties. And we will see you around the corner. Happy holidays. I hope it is peaceful and happy for all of you.